small amounts of electricity, artificially stimulate different parts of the brain, and control that person's thoughts and experiences. Determine exactly what they are experiencing. Okay, so let's look at a specific example of this kind of network. And that is the network that produces the conscious sensation of sight. Seeing something, just seeing light hitting your eye. These yellow arrows are the light. This is your retina, which is the back part of your eye. And the neurons that are sensitive to light are called photoreceptors. The light is turned into a neuronal signal in the photoreceptors, and that neuronal signal gets passed on to the other neurons in the network. It goes to a specific part of the thalamus. You don't need to know that name, but it winds up in a specific part of the cortex. And you do need to know that. So here's the brain. This neuron would be somewhere back here in the occipital lobe, in the back of the head. Activity here produces the sensation of seeing something. This is called also the visual cortex. If we opened up somebody's skull and artificially stimulated that part of the brain, they would see flashes of light. What happens if you hit the back of your head? Anybody fall and hit the back of their head and not totally lose consciousness? See stars. The same means you see stars. Probably by banging the back of your head very hard, you artificially stimulated these cells and produced the sensation of sight. Even though, in that case, there was nothing in front of the eyes. Even though when we artificially, with an electrode, stimulate those cells, there is nothing in front of the eyes, but the person sees light. Okay, now we have a very, very similar network that produces the sense of touch or pain. Again, there is a sensory neuron. A sensory neuron that is going to turn a physical stimulus, a mechanical stimulus of being touched on the skin or moving the hairs on the skin. This mechanical stimulus is going to be detected by axons from a sensory neuron, transduced into a neuronal signal in the sensory neuron, which has its cell body, in this case, outside of the central nervous system, like all sensory neurons, but in a structure called the dorsal root ganglion, which is a collection of sensory neurons that mediate the sense of touch or pain and that are right next to the spinal cord. So here is that unusual cell, say with an ending in the skin in the finger. There, you touch something with that finger, that mechanical movement is turned into a nerve signal, carried on through this network into a different part of the thalamus, but ends up in a different part of the cortex, something called the somatosensory cortex. Somato means body. These are the body senses. Touch, pain, tickle, pressure, all these senses that we detect with our body. And the somatosensory cortex is all lined up here. And that's where these final cortical neurons neurons are. And if you artificially stimulate a cell in this region of the brain, that person will feel as though someone is touching or tickling or maybe hurting a specific part of their body, even though nothing is going on in their body. Their mind experiences that sensation. Yeah.
Have they actually, like, a test been done on, like, animals and wolves and, like, to show that works?
Yes, what I'm telling you has actually been done to people. You can go to a neurosurgeon and say, open up my skull and stimulate me. And they'll be more than glad to do it. Now, not too many of you would volunteer to participate in an experiment like that, but there are many people who are more than glad to have their skull opened up and their brain artificially stimulated. People who might have tumors need to have their brain opened up, their skull opened up to see where the tumor is. People who have very bad epilepsy. Epilepsy is seizures produced by overactivity in the brain. These seizures usually start in one location in the brain called the focus. And it's the role of the neurosurgeon to find where the focus is. And this is primarily for people these epileptics who don't respond to drugs. So the neurosurgeon will stimulate around in the brain various places until they produce a seizure on the patient who's lying there with their skull open. And when they found that place, they'll say that's where the focus is, and they can surgically remove it, and the epileptic seizures stop. Okay, but in the process of trying to find this focus, you can do a lot of experiments. You stimulate different parts of the brain and ask the person, because you are fully conscious when you have this kind of brain surgery. It's painless to have your skull opened and artificial stimulation of your brain. Doesn't hurt at all. Minimal. Okay, so there are these, what I'm telling you, not stories that you could do. These are things that have actually been done. This is how we got this information. Okay, so we talked about the networks for vision and networks for touch. There is an exact comparable network that ends in neurons over here that's responsible for the sense of sound or auditory stimuli, production of sound. That's the auditory cortex. So there are different parts of the cerebral cortex, activity in which will produce different conscious experiences of senses. Now, this sounds as though, wow, look what these neuroscientists have figured out. They really know a lot about how the brain works. But let me tell you, if you think about this, there is still a problem here. Okay? And the problem is, after this first step, after sensory transduction has occurred, and you start producing signals in these networks, the signals in all sensory networks are the same. The signals in this network are the same as the signals in this network. So after this first step, the nature of the stimulus has disappeared. The same signals traveling in networks end in different parts of the brain and produce such different sensations. Think about how different light, the sense of light, is from the sense of sound, the sense of touch. Think about those things. They're hugely different from each other. What does it mean to say that those different senses are the result of signals traveling through networks activating different parts of the cerebral cortex where there are neurons that look the same in each part of that cortex. Where does the differences in sensation come from? I don't know. That is what we call the hard problem. In other words, we can talk about in as much detail as we possibly can about the cells and networks. And later today we'll start talking about the signals in these networks. And you talk about cells and you talk about molecules. And these cells and these molecules are so different from the things going on in your head. How are they equal? How is my feeling, and you all should be feeling totally bewildered about this, or in awe of this, how is this my feeling that I have of, wow, how does this be equivalent to some molecular events taking place in a neuronal network? We can't make that leap yet. That's a hard problem. And some people wonder whether we will ever make that leap, or whether there are certain limits to how much we can understand how the brain produces our thoughts. Very important question. The big question in neurobiology. Okay, let's go on to a next network, a next behavior. Okay, everybody, raise your right hand. Flex it at the elbow. Okay, you have now all performed a motor task. You have moved, you have changed state of contraction of your muscles, and you have done that consciously. Okay? Yes, you were following my instructions, but you said, yes, I'm going to do that. I'm going to lift my arm and I'm going to flex at the elbow. You have carried out some kind of conscious control of movement. Now, the very fact that you're doing that consciously means that you are using a particular part of the brain. Which part of your brain?
The motor cortex.
Well, that's specifically correct. But in general, whenever you do anything consciously or have a conscious experience, what part of the brain? Cerebral cortex. So you are using the cortex whenever your consciousness is used. And in this case, yes, you are performing a motor task consciously, and there is a part of the brain called the motor cortex where there are neurons. And the motor cortex is right about here. And you can think and say, I'm going to move my arm, and it starts activity in a cell in the motor cortex. We can do an experiment, open up someone's skull, artificially stimulate cells in the motor cortex, and they start moving, kicking different parts of their body. Okay. Now, so activity starts in this neuron in the motor cortex. It has a very long axon that goes down from the cortex and makes a synapse with a motor neuron in the spinal cord. That motor neuron sends a signal out and synapses with a muscle. When this cell is active and generating signals, and the motor neuron is sending motor signals to the muscle, What does the muscle do? What do muscles do? They change their length. In this case, it's going to shorten or contract. The motor signal in the muscle, the motor signal in the motor neuron tells the muscle contract. Okay? So let's say it's a flexion. This muscle could be the biceps. But we know, and I'm sure you all remember from our lecture on the muscle system, that every movement has two sets of muscles. One set of muscles that contracts, shortens, and an antagonistic set of muscles that lengthen. So in the arm, there is also going to be the triceps muscle. And in some way, activity in this neuron in the motor cortex, which sends signals this way to increase contraction, shorten the biceps muscle, at the same time has to send signals through a part of this network that is going to have the opposite effect on the triceps muscles. It's going to cause them to relax. How's it going to do that? Well, we have motor neurons that, when they're active, cause the triceps to contract. In some way, we have to get this signal from the motor cortex to come down and decrease contraction of this muscle, cause it to relax. We have to decrease activity of this motor neuron. And the way we do that is to have this same neuron, its axons branch, synapse on an interneuron, and have this interneuron make an inhibitory synapse on the motor neuron. Okay, now we're seeing inhibition, I told you before, is important. The same signal that come down this way, some go down this way. If they go this way, they increase contraction of the muscle. If they go this way, they decrease contraction of the muscle. Because this inhibitory signal here is going to result in a decrease in activity of the motor neuron. Decreased activity of the motor neuron, decreased contraction, relaxation of the muscle. Everybody follow that? Anybody have any questions? See, we're linking together things that you learned on the muscular system, why you have to have simultaneous changes in opposite directions in two antagonistic sets of muscles. And now we're showing we know that it's the neurons, the motor neurons, that control the state of contraction of the muscle, and how signals flowing in a network can at the same time shorten, contract muscles, lengthen, and relax muscles. All because we've added in here an inhibitory synapse. Okay? So, we have gotten networks which produce activity in the cortex that produce sensation of things going on in the external environment. We have activated neurons that produce movement, output of the nervous system, sensation, movement. What about everything in between? Well, everything that's in between is what we call the integrative functions of the nervous system. The analysis of all the sensory information, deciding which of that information is important, which of that information has to be responded to, and how to respond, and making the decision of what behavior to produce. And all of that is done in these other parts of the brain. And those networks are very complex, and we have minimal knowledge of those networks right now. So there is lots to discover in terms of the network approach to how the nervous system works. Okay. Now, there are other networks that lead to the production of movement that do not involve conscious thought, where you don't have to think about what I should move, how should I move it. Okay? These are movements that are done without the involvement of the cerebral cortex. These are behaviors or movements that we call motor reflexes. You don't need the cerebral cortex to produce these behaviors and these movements. These are particular behaviors that must be performed very rapidly without any thought or consideration. There are some behaviors that have to be done right away. And if you stop and think about them, it's too late. You probably lost your life, or you might be severely damaged. Okay, so for example, typical example of a reflex, you're walking along barefoot and you step on a piece of glass. If you step on that glass and you say, this feels like something sharp, probably a piece of glass, I probably should move my foot away from it. Okay, now, all those thought processes probably take a couple of seconds. In that time interval, which might seem short to you, your foot is still resting on that piece of glass and getting damaged. The best response is if, in some way, your body knows that as soon as that foot touches that piece of glass, that it's got to pull away as fast as possible without thinking about it. And we have a network that does it. And you've all had this experience where you've stepped on something sharp, touched something hot, and moved away from it. And then, after you've responded in the correct way, you have the sensation, ow, that hurt. That you became consciously aware that that was a painful stimulus and that you should move away from it. But you've already moved away from it without thinking. Look how smart your body is. Your body doesn't need this mind and thoughts to often perform the appropriate behaviors. It's wired to do it correctly. It's wired by having these reflexes. So there is a sensory neuron that detects that painful stimulus and directly sends a signal to the motor neuron that sends a signal to the muscle. Contract, bend the knee, remove the foot from the stimulus. All does this fantastically fast, in fractions of a second, without any thought. Now, there's something wrong with the way this network is drawn. You see it? It's a little bit overly simplified. What's missing from this picture? Every movement requires two sets of muscles. One that contracts, one that relaxes. What's missing? A quadriceps. There's only one set of muscles. This muscle is contracting. If the quads, which are here, do not relax, what's going to happen to them is they're going to tear as soon as this reflex is activated and those muscles shorten. Okay, so not only are they missing in this photo, but we're missing part of the network. Let's look at another reflex that you're also very familiar with, because this is the reflex that's tested every time you go for a physical exam. Right? The doctor always hammers your knee. Why do they do that? Do they? Who's had a physical lately? Do they hammer your knee? Yes? No? So you have a good doctor, he hammers your knee. If you have a lousy doctor, they don't? Not necessarily. What are they testing? When they are doing this, they are testing your reflexes, if your reflex is intact. What's happening here? When they hammer your knee, they are hammering a tendon. Remember tendons, which muscles use to attach the bones? They're hammering on that tendon and stretching it. They're stretching the muscle. Now there are sensory neurons. In blue here, there are sensory neurons that make contact with every muscle in your body and provide information about how much that muscle is being stretched, how much it is contracted. Your brain is getting information about all 700 plus muscles in your body and whether they're contracted or whether they're not. How many of you are aware of that? Nobody. No, you do not have to be aware of it. Your brain is getting that information, and from that information, your brain is generating a sense of having a body and being a body and having a body image. How many of you are aware of what your body is doing? How you are sitting, where your body is in space. You all should be right now. Okay? That is created from information like this neuron is providing. This neuron is providing information about what's happening to the muscles. Are they stretched? Are they relaxed? Okay, so what the doctor does when he hammers on this knee is very rapidly and suddenly stretch the muscle. Pulling on this tendon, the muscle stretches. How do you want the system to respond to this artificial stretch of the muscle? Start? Okay. What do we want that muscle to do now? How are we going to counteract the stretch? You want the muscle to contract, so this hammering doesn't tear the muscle. So we want this sensory neuron to be connected to a motor neuron that's connected to that muscle, and signals will flow along this part of the reflex network and cause that muscle to contract very rapidly without you having to think about it. Now, this is a better picture than the other one. It's a better picture because it shows the antagonistic, in this case, hamstring muscle. As this muscle contracts and shortens, this muscle has to relax and lengthen. Now, how are we going to get the same network, the same sensory neuron in this case, to shorten this muscle and relax and lengthen?